tonight we are having a webinar covering diets in EGIDs, eosinophilic gastrointestinal diseases. These are a follow-up to a series that we did in 2022 that I hope you've had a chance to see the videos on EOE, where Lucy and Hannah very kindly gave their time previously. If you haven't had a chance to watch them, I would encourage you to do so afterwards, because this will fill in the updates and some gaps from those meetings. And I appreciate very much that, as I say, Hannah and Lucy have joined us again. Just so you know a bit of background, Lucy comes from Great Ormond Street and is a specialist dietitian dealing with specifically eosinophilic diseases. So she has a comprehensive knowledge, alongside Hannah Hunter, who deals with allergy and specifically EOE and other EGIDs at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. So we've definitely got two experts in the room and we're grateful to have them. And I'm going to hand over now to Hannah.
Thanks, Amanda. So thanks for having us today, and it's nice to see all of you here today in a good mix of people. I'm going to start by giving a bit of a kind of revision recap for some of you about eosinophilic gastrointestinal diseases, and then we'll kind of move on. So we've structured the session today to do lots of frequently asked questions. So we'll be taking it in turns to ask and answer questions related to diet and EGIDs. So EGIDs affect all different parts of the gastrointestinal tract, and this diagram here shows you the most up-to-date terminology, starting with the esophagus. So EGIDs affecting the esophagus are eosinophilic esophagitis. We then move on to below the esophagus, and we've got eosinophilic gastritis affecting the stomach, and then eosinophilic enteritis affecting the small intestine, so the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and then finally eosinophilic colitis affecting the large intestine or the colon. So when we talk about diets today, they're all relevant to all the different types of EGIDs. The most, commonly and the most prevalent one that we talk about is EOE, but the other ones are part of the whole spectrum of the EGIDs. Can we move on? So a bit of background revision on eosinophils. So some of you might know this, but a bit of information in case you're not familiar as well. So eosinophils, so these are a type of white blood cell, and they're part of our immune system. And they're really important to deal with getting attacked by parasites, foreign bacteria, and other organisms as well. And they also play a role in allergic reactions. And as part of their role in dealing with these different situations, they release toxic proteins to deal with bacteria, to deal with parasites, and the eosinophils in the tissues then do also cause damage to the tissue, which results in inflammation. And this is the characteristic of what we see with the different EGIDs, and it will be different depending on which part of the gut is affected. So there are some more generalized symptoms that we tend to see. So things like difficulty eating and abdominal pain. But if it's very specific to the esophagus, we might tend to see more difficulty swallowing. If it's in the stomach, symptoms like nausea and vomiting. And then if it's affecting the lower parts of the gut, maybe more diarrhea and those type of symptoms. But a wide spectrum of symptoms that we do see in these conditions. And in terms of management, so treatment for the different conditions, there's the 3 Ds. So there's drugs, first of all, so steroids typically, and PPIs such as omeprazole and lansoprazole. Then we've got the diet, which we're going to be talking a lot about today, and then dilatation, which is mostly localized to the esophagus when people have narrowing or strictures, so stretching out the esophagus due to the associated complications of particularly EOE. So first I'm going to start by asking Lucy a question. So I think this is a question that is more relevant to pediatrics. So this is something a question that Lucy might come across. So I've been told to start a liquid-only diet using a special milk. I haven't tried any other dietary treatment yet. Is this really the only option?
Great, thanks Hannah. And Amanda or Elena, if you can kind of move the slide along as well. So if you've kind of done a little bit of reading on eosinophilic GI disease, but particularly on EOE, you might have heard of something called an elemental diet. And this is essentially when we use a liquid diet, so a specialized formula where the proteins are broken down into the tiny building blocks of that protein. And this is quite an old-fashioned or old school approach to managing these types of conditions, where someone might go on this completely liquid diet for sort of 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, depending on what service you're under, to try and get the inflammation in the food pipe particularly under control. But actually, the new guidelines that came out in 2023, and then we had the ESPGHAN guidelines last year, actually now recommend that we should only really be using this liquid-only diet in sort of a rescue treatment. So when you've tried all other things, so the other diets in EOE, and we will be talking about those first, and also, you know, thinking about using any medical management as well, potentially. So elementals diets do have a place in the management of eosinophilic GI disease, but in the most part, these are used kind of at the very end when everything else tried has not really been successful. Having said that, we might use some of these amino acid formulas to support someone's intake. So if you've lost lots of weight because you've been struggling to eat, or you know, you're struggling with some of the alternatives, which we will just touch on today as well, you know, we might use these in combination with the food that you're eating just to boost up, give a few extra calories, extra protein and micronutrients, and make sure that you're kind of getting everything that you need. Okay, but so I suppose, Hannah, what are the other dietary options that we have for EOE? So if we're kind of using the elemental just as a you know, a rescue treatment or a last resort, is there other things that people can try in the interim?
Definitely. So there's lots of different options for elimination diets with eosinophilic GI diseases. So if we think about, firstly, one food, if we were going to eliminate one food for eosinophilic GI diseases, it would be cow's milk, or all animal milks, I should say. So cow's milk is the most common food trigger that we see. So one option for an elimination diet is cow's milk elimination diet, and that expands to all dairy-based foods as well. The next option along is a 2-food elimination diet, so that would be milk plus one other food, and that could be wheat, or it could be eggs. So wheat and eggs are both kind of second in line for common food triggers that affect people. And if we move along to the next diet, it's the 4-food elimination diet. So that would be milk plus wheat plus eggs plus soya. And then we have the 6-food elimination diet, which is milk, wheat, egg, and soy. So as per the last 4, but then also peanuts, tree nuts, and then fish and shellfish as well. So it actually is really more than 6 food groups, because we're incorporating fish and shellfish and peanuts and tree nuts. So it is probably an 8-food elimination diet. And then we have the elemental diet, which we've heard a little bit about now, and we will touch on a little bit later as well. So Lucy, there are so many exclusion diets for EOE. I've just talked about a few of them. Where do we start? You know, what should we start with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the difficult question, and things that we often see as dietitians. You know, people have started with multiple food exclusions when maybe that's not really needed. So I'll just wait for the slide to move forward to sort of talk about that a little bit more. So what we do now in terms of our approach with diets is start with the least number of exclusions we can first. So we normally start, like Hannah said, with a 1-food exclusion diet or a 2-food exclusion diet. And you would be advised by your team or by your child's team to remove this allergen from the diet for a set period of time. And then you'd have another camera test to have a look in the esophagus or in the food pipe to see what had happened to the eosinophils that were there before. If the disease was not in remission, so the eosinophils were still present in diagnostic numbers, we do what we call as a step up approach. So rather than kind of going straight to the top, we then gradually increase. So then we take out, if we've excluded one food, we might take out 2 foods. The process would repeat again, to exclude that for a set period of time. And then we'd have another camera test. If it's not in remission, we step up again to the 4th food, and then the final step would be the 6th food exclusion diet. There used to be advice around the top-down approach. So some people might, if you've been diagnosed with EOE a while ago, been advised to start with a 6 food exclusion diet and then gradually reintroduce those foods. But actually what we found in the research is that doing the step-up approach reduces the number of general anesthetics that you need and reduces the number of endoscopies, the number of camera tests, by around about 30%. So it's quite a big reduction in the sort of the burden for you as patients, but also for the health service having to kind of fit these investigations in. And we also know that the majority of people who have a food trigger for their EOE only have 1 or 2 foods that actually trigger the eosinophils. So actually, for the most cases, we don't need to avoid all 6 to get the disease in remission. So we start with a low amount and gradually build up as and when's needed. And like we've already said, that elemental should just be kept for those cases where we're not winning with any other treatments that we've tried. So I just wanted to sort of flag this to you. So this is actually from a guideline, and you can scan that QR code there if you do want to have a read through the whole guideline at some stage, bedtime reading. But this is a dietetic algorithm that we kind of work from when looking at managing EOE with diet. So obviously we need to diagnose the condition and make sure that, if we're treating with the diet, that EOE is confirmed, and that various treatment options has been discussed with you guys as your patients or with the family members, so you can make that informed decision if you want to go down the diet route, or you might prefer a medical management instead. As dietitians, we'd be wanting to sort of thinking about how your growth is or your weight is, if you've lost any weight, if you've had any micronutrient deficiencies, and we've ruled out any other conditions. If you're already following any exclusion diets, we know that individuals who have eosinophilic GI disease tend to be more atopic, which means that they might have other allergy type conditions. So you might have an immediate allergy to fish, for example, and not eat it anyway. So we'd be thinking about all of those types of things when we're thinking about exclusion diets and discussing those with you. We also want to be thinking about what your symptoms are or feeding behaviors are. So there's some key things which we'll talk about a little bit later, but we're looking at with EOE because it can impact the eating quite significantly. So length of meal times can be a little bit longer. Swallowing certain textures can be really tricky, or food getting stuck. You might find that you need lots of fluid with eating to kind of help kind of push that food down. And then also we've got, in children in particular, sort of very aversive eating, or sort of what people describe as fussy eating, but potentially a little bit more than what we might consider to be a classic fussy eater. And then thinking about any supplements, if you're a gym bunny, you might be taking loads of whey protein or something else as well that could be adding into, all of these allergens in your diet. And as you said, we take a sort of a step up approach. So the exclusion, followed by a histological reassessment, so another camera test. And then we either take more foods out or put foods in and then do another camera test and follow that process.
I think what's really important to understand as well is that with the step up approach, like if you've just started with avoiding, say, milk and wheat, that if you don't respond to avoiding those two, that doesn't rule those things out as triggers. So when you're stepping up, you need to continue to avoid those 2 foods alongside other foods, because it could be one or both of those alongside something else as well. I think that's something that's really important to understand.
Absolutely, that combination of those foods together as well, definitely. Okay, so we've got a patient, Hannah, who's been prescribed some steroid medication, so an oral viscous budesonide to treat their EOE. Do they need to follow a diet as well as taking this medical treatment?
So generally, if you've been prescribed either steroids or a PPI such as omeprazole or lansoprazole as a first line treatment for your EOE, then usually you don't need to follow an elimination diet at the same time. So a steroid on its own or omeprazole on its own, they can each be single treatments that can be effective on their own. So, and that means that you don't need to eliminate foods or follow one of these elimination diets at the same time. And I think sometimes when we get a new diagnosis or we are learning about the condition, we obviously want to feel better. We want to, improve the condition, so we can be inclined to try different approaches at the same time. But, it's really important that we don't restrict our diet unless we need to, because firstly, it can get quite confusing about, which treatment's working versus another. But also elimination diets are restrictive. So it puts us at risk of not getting enough nutrients and also not enjoying what we're doing. So if we're eliminating foods, it can be quite challenging. It takes up more time. It's not as enjoyable. So if it's not needed, then we shouldn't be doing it. But what we should do is, if we are on medical treatment, try and make sure that our diet is healthy and balanced. So we know that it's better for our immune system, and we'll talk a bit more about this a bit later, but good to try and make sure we're getting all our different food groups, good variety and a healthy balance within our diets, and getting a good diverse diet. And that just gives our immune system the best chance of responding to the treatments that we are having.
Absolutely. And I suppose just to add in here, I don't know so much in adults if you do this, Hannah, but we might in pediatrics find that children do need a dual therapy. So they might need a combination of, say, the PPI and a dairy-free diet to manage their disease. But we, again, do that in a very structured approach and do one treatment at a time to understand what's needed for the response. So there's not just everything thrown at, things all at one time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it might be a combination therapy is needed further down the line, but not as kind of first approach.
Absolutely, yeah, not a diagnosis. Yeah.
So our next question is, does any diet approach help with other eosinophilic GI disorders beyond EOE?
Yeah, so I think this is a bit of a tricky question, and the data is not quite as strong as what we see in EOE. And I suppose it's important to say, and I know Hannah mentioned at the beginning about the different types of EGID, and I know Amanda and the team have some other webinars and sessions planned. But I just wanted to mention that throughout our GI tract, we do have eosinophils. That's normal for there to be some eosinophils within the GI tract, apart from really the esophagus. That's the only place that we don't normally expect to see them. The other parts, there is a certain number, which has only recently been kind of named as a threshold that we would expect to see there. So if you have a biopsy and there are some eosinophils, but it's not diagnostic of these conditions, that's because there's just not enough to meet that threshold. So just wanted to explain that. But as I've already said, the sort of diet link with other types of EGID, so non-esophageal EGID, isn't as well understood. And that's a combination of different things. So EGID of other parts of the GI tract is very rare. And actually a lot of the research that is out there, and obviously as clinicians, we use evidence-based practice, so we look at what's published. A lot of those are very small study of a small number of patients or case reports. So it's difficult to then extrapolate that data to the wider population that might have these conditions. So we know that for some of the conditions, it's slightly better to use the diet, or you might have slightly favorable outcomes compared to other types. And it is definitely an approach that we use. It is a similar approach that we would use in EOE. So we would start with probably a 2 food exclusion diet and then go to a 4 food exclusion diet for the majority of the non-EOE EGIDs. But with these types of conditions, it's really important that you are working with the specialists and with any exclusion diet, but particularly with these, because you do have lots of symptoms that are sort of triggering sort of in the lower GI tract rather than the upper GI tract. And it can be helpful to have someone like a dietitian to help unpick whether that's related to the EGID, or could there be an IBS overlap, or, you know, just how these things kind of digest within the GI tract. So yes, we do use diets, but I would say they're not always as successful as what we see them in EOE. I don't know if you'd agree, Hannah, with that.
Yeah, definitely. It always seems a lot trickier, and you know, I think often combination therapy or, you know, different approaches are needed, but yeah, definitely more tricky.
And just to say, I will add at that point, anybody who has any questions around this, as Lucy mentioned, we do have webinars which we'll tell you more about before you leave this evening, so don't worry.
Okay, so we're starting an exclusion diet because EOE is confirmed. So how long does someone need to exclude that food for? And actually, after they've excluded it and they've had an endoscopy, is that EOE now cured forever, or is there something else that needs to be done or thought about?
So the new guidelines do say that any elimination that's done for EOE specifically, that's what the guidelines are for, should be for 8 to 12 weeks minimum. So I think some of the older practice used to be to do elimination diets for 6 weeks, and that's certainly what we used to do. And I think 4 to 6 weeks is long enough for some people, but it's certainly not long enough for everybody. So our standard practice now is minimum 8 weeks, but ideally a little bit longer to ensure that we're getting the full resolution from the diet. Because if we do a shorter time and we get a certain result that's, you know, there's shown some improvement, but it's not a full improvement, we sometimes aren't able to know if that's because the diet hasn't been done for long enough, or because, you know, it's not the right approach for that particular person, because there's potentially another food trigger as well. So really important to make sure that we do it for the right amount of time. And then once we have identified the food trigger, we do advise long-term elimination of that food trigger. So we do know that if you reintroduce that food and you keep consuming it, even if you've had a good response from that 8 to 12 week elimination, if you start having it again, the condition will recur. And that's because, as it says here, so removing food doesn't cure the EOE, it can just treat the inflammation. So you still have the condition, but the management is the elimination of the specific food triggers, if that's worked.
And I suppose just to add there, 12 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks is ideal. It can, in reality, I'm sure you guys as patients or, family members of people who have EOE, it might be longer than 12 weeks that you get that next endoscopy, because there's limited capacity within sort of the NHS or within a lot of services to be able to do it sort of bang on that time period. So if it is a little bit longer, don't worry, that doesn't really matter. Your team will be definitely getting you in for a follow-up endoscopy as soon as they sort of have capacity to do that.
So this is my favorite question, I think. Can I just have an allergy test to tell me what my food trigger is? Do I really need to go through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question we get all the time. I had it today in clinic. So, we would love to be able to say, right, we'll do an allergy test and we can tell you that X, Y, and Z is the trigger for your EOE. But unfortunately, that doesn't work. So we know that EOE is a type of sort of allergy called a non-IgE mediated food allergy, which means it doesn't involve sort of antibodies that trigger the allergic reaction. And the only tests available for sort of allergy testing at the moment is for our IgE mediated food allergies. So the immediate ones where you might see someone have anaphylaxis, they get the swelling, they get the hives, they get the breathing difficulties. They're the allergy tests we have available. For EOE, there isn't anything that's helpful, unfortunately, at this stage. I don't know if someone can move the slides on forward for us. Yeah. And the ones we have in immediate food allergies, so IgEs, we've got our skin prick tests, which if some of you do have allergies, or you might have heard of, where we put a little bit of solution on the forearm and use a little lancet to just prick that and see if there's a wheal that develops. Then we've also got a specific IgE blood test, and this is looking at the number of these sort of antibodies within the blood. And we can look at those for specific allergens. So we can look at those levels for milk or wheat or soya or nuts or any of those types of things to see if a patient is sensitized to that food protein. But either way, they're not sort of appropriate for the use in EOE for targeting what we might need to exclude. I just also wanted to highlight that things like York tests, hair analysis, Vega testing, pulse testing is not recommended. That's for EOE, but also for any allergies. There's not any evidence that these can identify food intolerances or food allergies. So please don't waste your money on those at all. Whether you've got EOE or not, and you just want to find out about intolerances, they're not worth the money for that. If you could move on, Amanda. So this is just highlighting again about those tests, those York tests, up to £200 at a pop, and they do give you a printout that looks, pretty good in terms of what you might think for an allergy. So red to avoid, green is good to go, but actually these are not validated, so we definitely don't recommend them. Having said that, we don't do skin prick testing or allergy testing to identify foods to remove for EOE. We might, at the point of reintroduction, especially if it's been a prolonged exclusion period, actually repeat some allergy tests before putting those foods back in. And that's because there's some emerging sort of evidence and case reports of patients who have eosinophilic esophagitis in particular, who've removed various food proteins for the management of their condition, that have then converted to an immediate food allergy after that period of exclusion. So that's been a number of different symptoms that have been reported. You've got immediate hypersensitivity to milk. There's been anaphylaxis reported to wheat, and there's sort of urticaria, which is kind of spots and hives kind of spread everywhere following the reintroduction of soya. And these tend to be more prevalent in individuals who have eczema in particular, but those sort of atopic conditions as well. So although we might not use these tests to guide what we might want to take out, we might use them to put foods back in a safe way and make sure we're not putting anyone at risk.
Yeah, I just add as well that we do use allergy testing in our clinic to tell us about environmental allergens. Yeah. So we do a lot of testing to things like pollens and dust, if there's a history of reactivity to these, just because that does tell us a bit more information about the person, and there can be some confusing overlap between symptoms sometimes. So we want to make sure that there are other allergic conditions like hay fever are well managed, and asthma, so that that we know that we're treating the right condition. But we'll talk a little bit more about pollen a little bit later as well, and why that's relevant to test.
Okay, so obviously there's lots of foods that can potentially be removed to manage EOE or EGID. So how do we make sure that someone's diet is adequate and they're getting everything that they need?
Yep, so all these different 6 food groups provide all different nutrients. So if we start off firstly looking at cow's milk is a good source of protein for us. It's a really one of our major sources of calcium, but also many other micronutrients as well. So things like magnesium, phosphorus, iodine, riboflavin, and then other vitamins as well. The next group is wheat, and for us that's a major source of fiber, but many other different micronutrients as well as listed here. So, and that can be in some fortified foods as well. Then we've got egg, which it depends on the overall composition of your diet, but particularly if you're a vegetarian, then that might be a major source of protein for you. But eggs also provide many other different micronutrients as well, so things like selenium, iron, various B vitamins, and vitamin A, D, E as well. Soya is the next group, and again, depending on what the rest of your diet is, this might be for you a major source of protein. So particularly if you're vegetarian or follow a plant-based diet, that might be one of your major protein sources. But again, soya is also a source of many different other nutrients, so things like fiber, calcium, iron, and other B vitamins as well. Things like tree nuts and peanuts, again, could be a source of protein. So protein is a really common a theme that's coming up here from all the different food groups, but also, again, lots of different micronutrients. Fish and seafood, a good source of protein again, but also things like iodine. Sometimes for some people, fish is a source of calcium, particularly if you're eating the bones in fish. And then a really important source of our essential fatty acids, so the omega-3 fatty acids. And if you think about, you're potentially avoiding all 6 of these, that's quite a lot of different, really good sources of various different nutrients. So thinking about suitable alternatives if you are on a 6 food elimination diet, so you're avoiding all these different food groups from the last slide. So your main sources of protein are things like meat, so chicken, turkey, some types of corn, but not all corn, because some of them do contain egg or other allergens such as wheat. Things like beans and pulses, but not, of course, the soya, pea-based milks, seeds, and tahini, which is sesame paste as well. But if you think about, if you're avoiding some of these foods for other reasons, so a lot of our patients will have like other allergies. So you might have a legume allergy and not be able to eat beans or pulses. You might have like a plant-based diet or different cultural preferences for these foods. So protein is one thing that can be really difficult on a 6 food elimination diet, particularly if you've got other restrictions. For the B vitamins, other sources are things like pork, nutritional yeast, fortified cereals, and some of the fortified plant-based milks as well. But then some of these foods are not always suitable, and we don't always want to be having a lot of these foods. So Marmite is listed as an example, but it is quite salty. For calcium, so we've removed our main source of calcium, which was the cow's milk-based foods, but also another alternative, which was the fish. So our main replacements are the fortified plant-based milks. And there are some other natural sources, but it can be quite challenging to get enough from these natural sources, things like oranges, fortified cereals, some vegetables, but they're not as good sources as cow's milk. We get iodine from some fortified milk alternative products, but they're not all fortified with iodine. Same with calcium, they're not all fortified with calcium. And we get some natural iodine from things like seaweed or seaweed products. Magnesium we get from things like quinoa, potatoes, bananas, dried fruit, and dark chocolate as well as seeds. And then our fiber we get from things like fruits, vegetables, seeds, grains, and skin on potatoes. And our omega-3 and 6 we get from vegetable oils, algae-based supplements, and some seeds as well. So you can see that it is possible to replace all these different nutrients, but it's important to have a really good variety in the diet and get some really good advice around this as well, if particularly if there are other dietary restrictions, because it can be quite challenging to meet your nutritional requirements while avoiding this many foods. There are alternatives for eggs as well. So we've got some, there are some products that you can get. So this one in the middle here, but there's lots of natural egg replacements as well, depending on what you're wanting out of the properties of the egg. So you can use chia seeds or flax seeds mixed with water, which helps with the binding properties of egg. You can use chickpea water, which helps to get a kind of a fluffy meringue type texture. You can use applesauce or mashed banana if you're looking for a bit of moisture. Or you can use things like yogurt or plant-based yogurt alternatives. Nut butters or tofu can be an egg replacer as well, depending on you can make kind of scrambled egg replacement with tofu. So there's lots of different things you can do with different foods, which helps with the properties of egg. But all these different things give you more variety in your diet as well and different options. And thinking about different alternatives for different food groups, so thinking about particularly like cereals and grains, there's a big range of different wheat-free alternatives to that are available. So these are just listed in alphabetical order, but your big alternatives are things like potatoes and rice and corn, but you've also got things like amaranth, beans, buckwheat, like coconut, flax seeds, so linseeds, quinoa, tapioca. So there's a big range of different products that are available now and can be used in all different ways. And often what we use in cooking or in products is a blend of these different cereals and grains as a flour or as part of a recipe. In terms of replacing bread, when you can't have wheat, there's lots of different wheat or gluten-free breads and wraps and other products available. For crackers and crisp breads, we use rice cakes, corn cakes, and gluten-free oat cakes, as long as they don't have kind of cheesy ingredients in them.
Yeah, so say cheesy, not easy.
Yeah. I didn't know if that was just something I didn't know, but I thought it meant cheesy. For our cereals, we tend to use like rice or corn-based cereals, so Rice Krispie type things, cornflakes, oat-based foods, but there's also cereals made from buckwheat, millet, quinoa, sorghum as well as gluten-free oats as a cereal. As alternatives to pasta, pizza, noodles, we've got a lot of replacements are made from corn or rice, but there's also buckwheat and lots of different alternatives made from things like lentils and pea now as well. And I think for all of these different food groups, there's more and more products coming out all the time and many more alternatives, and lots of recipes online if you want to make your own versions as well. So Lucy, so a lot of these free-from foods, I've just talked a bit about some of them, seem like they're ultra-processed foods. So, and I've heard that that UPFs are bad for your health and your gut. So should I be avoiding these as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is very topical, isn't it? I think gut health is, everywhere at the moment. So if Amanda or whoever can move forward the slides, that would be great. So I suppose just to give a bit of an overview about ultra processed foods or processed foods. So when we're thinking about this, they're classified using something called the NOVA classification. And you might have heard of this, you might not. And essentially foods are kind of split into four main groups, looking at if they're minimally processed, I can't say it, or ultra processed or processed towards the end. So as we get from group 1 to 4, sort of the level of processing increases. But I think it's important to say that not all ultra processed foods are the same. And there might be a place for using some of these processed foods within your diet, especially if you're on, an exclusion diet. So for example, if we're thinking about something that we would consider to be sort of processed or ultra processed, would be something like a cereal, for example. But actually, these are often fortified very well with things like calcium or B vitamins or iron in particular. And actually, I work with pediatrics. they're quite a key source for some of these micronutrients for a lot of children. So we'd consider that would be something that we would be happy to be included in the diet. Obviously, we'd give advice around which would be a better option in terms of sugar and salt content, etc. But they do have some place within the diet depending on what your needs are. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So as I've said, not all ultra processed foods are the same, and you've got your 6 food exclusion diet, and we can see here this lovely colourful image of all the fruits and veggies which are suitable in the 6 food exclusion diet. You've got rice, which is suitable. You've got meat, sort of fresh meat and seeds and potatoes. These are all sort of naturally free from the top 6, but actually would be a great sort of diet within the 6 food exclusion diet. But then on the other side here, we've also got a number of foods that are free from on the 6 food exclusion diet, but potentially maybe not giving quite as good all-round nutrition as the other picture. But there are a few things within this that, for me as a dietitian, I would want to include in a child's diet in particular. So fortified plant-based milks would be something that I would, encourage people to have, because that's a great source of calcium in their diet. So it's a really helpful thing to make sure that we're meeting. We can move on. But there is some work being done about ultra processed foods in EOE. So these are some studies that are being conducted kind of at the moment. So there's some in America and there's some in Naples. So looking at food additives and whether removal of those from the diet impact eosinophilic esophagitis. And then we've also looking at, or in Naples, they're looking at sort of products within ultra processed foods, and whether that is implicated in sort of the development of eosinophilic esophagitis. So it's a hot topic, and there's definitely work being done about it. But like I say, as long as the majority of your diet is sort of your whole foods within your restrictions, some of these ultra processed foods can be helpful to support from a nutritional perspective, as needed. But if you do want to kind of improve your gut health and keep the immune system sort of happy as such, so we know that sort of plant-based diversity is the key to supporting our gut, and that's because plant-based diversity helps feed the bacteria in the gut, which then produce something called a short-chain fatty acid. And these short-chain fatty acids have sort of immune modulating sort of benefits, where they kind of help keep the epithelial cells, so the cells within the gut, nice and tight, so that pathogens and bacteria can't get through. They also kind of help support the immune system in sort of other ways and support our gut-brain connection. So there's some things that wouldn't be sort of on the top 6. So things like olive oil, extra virgin olive oil in particular, is very good for your gut. A wide variety of fruits and vegetables, so as many colors and varieties as you can get, is really important. And where you can, keeping those skins on the veggies and on the fruits, just give them a good wash, because that helps increase the fiber a little bit more. You've got our beans and our pulses, apart from the soya, that can be included. So you can add a handful into your spaghetti bolognese, or you can go for a mixed bean chili or casserole rather than just using one type of bean. And actually having that diversity helps support the gut. We've got our herbs and spices, so that's dried herbs, that's fresh herbs. All of those help support sort of the gut and the immune system. And because we can't use things like nuts if we're on the 6 food exclusion diet, seeds are a really fantastic alternative and great fiber source to feed that bacteria in the gut. And they're also packed full, some of them are packed full of omega-3, and omega-3 has also been shown to be beneficial sort of for gut health and sort of the microbiome and diversity within the gut. Okay, so I've heard lots of different advice, Hannah. Do I need to avoid gluten Or do I avoid wheat, rye, barley, oats? Like what do I need to, is it everything or just wheat?
Yes, definitely a great question. I don't think there's, a clear consensus, amongst this, of this question amongst professionals. So can we move on to the slide, please? Perfect. But I think it's firstly really important to understand like the difference between wheat versus gluten, because sometimes the words are used interchangeably and they're definitely not the same thing. So firstly, wheat. So wheat is a type of grain and it's found in things like used to make things like bread, pasta, cereals, and baked goods. It does contain different proteins, and this does, and one of the major protein groups in wheat are the gliadins, which it comes under gluten. So gluten is found in wheat, but it's also found in other grains that are very similar. So things like barley and rye. Some types of oats do contain gluten, but this is due to cross-contamination. So oats are often contaminated from the field all the way through manufacturing to the products on our shelves, and they're contaminated with wheat, rye, and barley. So oats don't naturally contain gluten, but a lot of oat products are contaminated. Oats contain different proteins that are similar but a little bit different to gluten. And it's the gluten proteins that give bread its elasticity and the chewy texture. And that's why a lot of our gluten-free products struggle so much to replicate that kind of texture, and it can be a little bit more crumbly. So with EOE, the current guidelines are that you only need to avoid wheat specifically unless you've been advised otherwise by one of your healthcare professionals. And that does mean that you can have rye, barley, and oat-based foods and oat-based milks as well. I would add that, so as part of my practice, I generally do advise people to avoid rye and barley. And that's just because we know that the proteins in them are so similar. And I think it's probably a little bit different in adults versus as children. We had a discussion about it earlier. So adults do tend to be more likely to consume like heavily rye-based foods. So adults may, if you can't have wheat, you may switch to having rye bread, rye vita, rye-based foods, and these are quite more concentrated sources of rye, which children are probably less likely to have. So what I don't want is my adults to switch from having wheat to having lots of rye, which is very, very similar. We don't consume that much barley generally. And so some of the barley-based foods that we consume are in things like cereals and vinegars, and don't tend to be that concentrated. So, in things like beer as well, but don't tend to have as much an effect due to concentration. But that's my personal practice. Other people do things differently. And I know, Lucy, you say it's in children, it tends to be specifically wheat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we had a bit of a discussion earlier today, and we tend to just remove wheat first rather than all forms of gluten. We only really take out gluten as a whole when we're struggling to get the disease under control. So there might be some of these other sort of proteins that could be triggering the disease. But in the most part, we advise just wheat. We do allow oats and oat milks that are not gluten-free. And so, in the majority of the cases, we're happy for children to have those. I would say, like I said to Hannah earlier, I don't have many children on my caseload who will happily accept a rye bread. The texture doesn't go down quite as well with children. So it's not really an issue so much for us that, people move over to rye-based products. But I can see an adult sort of practice, it'd be a different maybe transfer of foods that might be used as a replacement.
Yeah, I think you need to be guided by your own team, and what the practice is done in your centre.
Absolutely.
So we talked about soy as part of the 6 food elimination diet, but does this extend to avoiding all legumes if you're avoiding soya?
So it doesn't actually, in the current guidelines, that we don't recommend that all legumes should be avoided if you're avoiding soya. So we'd still be encouraging you actually to have other legumes in the diet. So lentils, of course, unless you had an IgE mediated allergy to any of these foods, like lentils, butter beans, kidney beans, aduki beans. All of these are a fantastic source of protein, but also a great source of dietary fiber. Also, we would recommend using peas as well in the diet, and there's lots of pea-based proteins and things around that can be helpful. If you do want to kind of increase your protein intake, a little bit. And also things like baked beans. Obviously, we do have to check that they don't have any sneaky wheat or anything else in them, depending on what the brand is. But these are a great, easy, quick after school snack or dinner that can be a really helpful part of the diet. So we don't advise to avoid all legumes. It's just the soya on the elimination diet. Okay, but how do we know if a food contains one of these proteins that someone has to avoid?
So I think when you're on any kind of elimination diet for EGIDs, that you need to become a bit of an expert label reader. And we do have quite good food allergen labeling laws in Europe and the UK. So these laws were initially throughout the EU, and we've adopted them in our UK law now. And this requires that all the common food allergens, so there's 14 top allergens, and these must be declared on the packaging. And they're usually emphasized in some way, either in bold or underlined sometimes, but mostly in bold. And all the 6 foods that are part of the common 6 foods that we eliminate for EGIDs are top allergens. So these are foods that will be emphasized in some way. So if you look at the example label on the right hand side here, this contains lots of different types of milk, but what you will see is that it's lots of different forms of milk. So you've got dried whole milk, you've got whey powder, you've got milk sugar, but what they're emphasizing is the word milk, so that it's clear what the actual allergen is. So they're not bolding, a word like butter, which it might not be necessarily very clear straight away. And this applies to all packaged and manufactured foods and drinks as well, sold throughout the EU. It also applies to loose foods, so foods from bakeries, butchers, cafes, and now foods pre-packed for direct sale, so any kind of sandwich bars, food outlets, etc. What's really important to know, though, if you do go outside of the EU, so to other countries, that the labeling laws are different. So it might not be so clear what the allergens are in the food products. They might not be popping out in bold at you in the same way.
I might just throw in a bonus question there, if that's all right, Hannah.
Yeah.
So it said on that label, soya lecithin. What's your advice around avoiding these types of kind of soya emulsifiers in the diet with sort of EGID conditions?
Yeah, so I mean, soy lecithin is a very, very highly processed form of soya. So there's almost no soya left in the soya lecithin. So that would be an acceptable thing to include on a soya exclusion diet for an EGID. I think my only caveat with that is that obviously I talked about it's very highly processed. And emulsifiers are a bit topical as well in terms of ultra processed things. So they might not be the best thing to be including in your diet on a regular basis. So these are not things that we want you to be necessarily having a lot of. They're okay as occasional things, but it's not a great thing to be having lots of soya lecithin anyway. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw it there, and obviously the soya is bold, so that's the thing that your eyes go to straight away.
Yeah.
And I think lots of things have soya lecithin in which, if you're looking at package, you think, oh gosh, I can't eat anything at all because it's got this soya lecithin in. So yeah, that would be exactly the same process as us. We try and limit emulsifiers and additions and additives wherever possible, but they do crop up in some of these products. So yeah, we allow soya lecithin as well.
Yeah, like we say, it's okay to have as a as an occasional thing.
Absolutely.
I've got an alert telling me that I'm speaking Spanish. I don't think I am. I'm very sure I'm still speaking English. Okay. So this is a test for me as well, isn't it? Some unusual suspects. So some hidden food allergens in these different products. You can tell me if I get some of these wrong. So we take sausages. We think these are maybe just pork sausages, but quite commonly sausages might have wheat in them. And then sometimes actually egg as well crop up in some types of sausages, sometimes even milk. And then like now some sausages are using more wheat-free ingredients, so they might contain things like chickpea flour or pea protein we see as well, cropping up in lots of different meat-based products. Our Worcester sauce is a hidden source of fish that often contains anchovy, but also barley, if we are avoiding barley, but we might not be. Our chewits contain eggs, which is a bit surprising, but they're a source of egg. Royal icing, also a source of egg. Our chicken, I had to look this one up, I didn't know which allergen it was.
Sneaky one.
This is milk.
Yeah.
So we might think that milk will be in some crisps, so it will be in cheesy crisps, of course, like cheese and onion crisps. But you can see things like milk pop up in flavors you wouldn't expect, like chicken. I thought this might actually be soya because I think there is some soya in some of these Walker's crisps as well. So soy can pop up as an ingredient. You can also find wheat in crisps as well. But yeah, you really need to read all the ingredients for all products. The OXO cubes are a source of wheat often as well, but sometimes milk as well. Yeah, another really, I think, key question that people ask a lot is, what do we do about these may contain foods?
Yeah, and I think these are really difficult, aren't they? Because there's so many ways that this can be written on the packet. It might say may contain, made in a factory with or where something else is, traces of, possible cross-contamination, not suitable for a child or an adult with X allergy, and may not be suitable. So there's actually no legislation around these labels, and we call them patient advisory labels or PALs. And so it doesn't mean that if something says it may contain traces of, that it's more likely to than something that says it's made in a factory where this food is also made. So at the moment, there's no standardization in these statements. And actually what we often find is that companies will add them to their products because it gives them a safety net in case someone were to have a reaction to them. Our advice is that we're happy for patients to have products that have PAL statements on them, unless for some reason you have eaten it and there's been a reaction. But on the majority, we're happy for patients to eat foods with precaution labels on them. Is that the same in adults as well, Hannah?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for the most part, we say, don't worry about these labels. I think there's only one exception that I tend to talk to people about, and it's more relevant for some people. But the thing is with dark chocolate, so that a lot of dark chocolate is quite heavily contaminated with milk. So our milk allergy patients who've got severe milk allergies will often react to dark chocolate that says may contain milk. And that's because of the way that dark chocolate is made. It's heavily contaminated in the factory because of the way they make it. And so, it's not, important if you don't eat very much of it. But I do have adults who eat quite a lot of dark chocolate, particularly if you're on a milk elimination diet. And so I have seen that, trigger a recurrence for some of our patients if they're eating a lot of dark chocolate. So I do say it's something that I do say to be careful with, particularly if it's a common thing in the diet is specifically to dark chocolate. But for the rest of foods, I don't worry about may contain milk or other warnings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add a caveat to that? And unless, of course, you've got an immediate allergy,
Yeah.
and then that's a different ballgame.
That's a completely different question that
Yeah,
different
and
kind of plans.
yeah, I think that's very variable in practice as well, at the moment. So yeah. I mean, it can be really daunting if you're following an exclusion diet, whether that's for EGID or for, other types of allergies. And lots of people are worried about eating out. So is there any kind of tips around eating out whilst following exclusion diets?
Yeah, definitely. So like one of the best things you can do if you know you're going to be eating out is to call ahead to check, with the restaurant or establishment that your needs can be catered for. Lots of restaurants now do have a lot of information online. So they might have their menus and allergen lists on their website. So particularly if it's a chain restaurant, it might be fairly standardized, and you might be able to download the allergen information and see in advance what's suitable. When you're ordering and when you're discussing choices, you need to remember to think about hidden allergens where you might not expect to see food. So things like sauces, dressings, sharing plates can be quite tricky when they've got lots of different things on them, and the risk for contamination between them as well. So really important to inform the staff as soon as you arrive as well, even if you've called ahead, and have a really good conversation with them. And if you feel like there's not very much understanding, or they're not taking it seriously, then it's best to not eat in that establishment and choose somewhere else. A good tip, particularly if you're on a more restricted diet, is to choose more simple things that you can understand what the ingredients are from the menu. And the worst things are things like buffets and self-serve salad bars, because there's lots. It can be difficult to know what's in what, and also things can get mixed up and contaminated. And what I tend to advise people with eating out as well is, so particularly during that 8 to 12 week strict elimination phase, and when we're looking to see if the diet has worked or not, it's best to try and limit eating out if you can, if you've got control over it. Firstly, because it's less enjoyable potentially. You might not want to be doing those things, but also there's the risk of eating the things inadvertently and not knowing about it. So you're not going to eat the food and get symptoms. So you're not going to really know if you've eaten something accidentally. So if you do have control of it and can reduce eating out during that phase, then it's probably a good thing to do. So I think when we plan our elimination diets, we're often thinking about time of year, what's coming up, what events are happening, have you got weddings, have you got travel, so that we can fit in that 8 to 12 week window where you've got the best chance of being able to stick to a diet, so we can really see if it's worked or not. I think the worst thing is going through that whole process and having quite a few slip-ups and not really knowing if it's really worked. So I think it's really good to give it the best shot.
Absolutely. And I don't think you had a chance to ask a question there, but I think it was just saying, how do we know if the diet are working? And so we've already shown you this diagram. So as we've said, the only way that we can assess if a diet is working or not is to do another camera test. And that can be quite difficult at the beginning, when you're first diagnosed with eosinophilic GI disease, but particularly EOE. You might require multiple endoscopies within the first year, and that could be, if they're every 8 weeks, that could be every 12 weeks, it could be up to 4 endoscopies in a year. So it is quite invasive to see if the treatment is working. At the moment, there's not any other sort of blood tests that we can do, or stool tests. There are some work being done about using something called a string test, which means that you wouldn't have to be put to sleep, but essentially swallow a pill that has a little sponge, I suppose, on the end of it, and then that's pulled back up and collects the eosinophils. There's also some work being looking at using something called a transnasal endoscopy, which is where the camera goes up the nose like a sort of a feeding tube, and again, that generally doesn't need a general anesthetic. But the way we check to see if the diets are working is to have another camera test and count the number of eosinophils. So the magic number is 15. So you might have heard about people saying there's greater than 15 eosinophils per high power field. And that's basically looking at, in a microscope lens, how many of these cells are present. And when you have a biopsy, what they do is they take 3 samples, so from the top, the middle, and the bottom of the food pipe, and then we're looking at for the highest count of the eosinophils within the food pipe in particular. There's different cutoffs for different parts of the GI tract, which actually, to be honest, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure one of the doctors will tell you that on, on one of the other webinars. So we want this level to be less than 15 per high power field, is the terminology that's used. We also look at it per millimeter squared as well, because not all microscope lenses are the same. But most people will refer to it in using that diagnostic criteria. And it's considered to be what we call deep remission if we're less than 6 eosinophils per high power field. So you mentioned earlier about pollen season and potentially doing allergy testing, looking at environmental allergens. So does the pollen season impact the diet, and does it impact EOE?
Yeah, so definitely, and this is quite topical for a study that we did a couple of years ago in our patients at Guy's, and we did find, so we looked back at our different patients who'd undergone elimination diets, and we did find that there was a much lower response to diet during the pollen season in people sensitized to pollen versus people who followed the elimination diets outside of the pollen season when they were allergic to pollen. So it's definitely something to think about when we plan our elimination diets going forwards. So we do know that some people with EOE can have flares of their EOE within the pollen season. What you can try and do is to keep a symptom diary during the pollen season to see if your symptoms do change. This is obviously going to affect people with hay fever for the most part. But yeah, that's why we think carefully about the timing of the endoscopy so that we can work out if EOE is triggered by pollen. So if we're doing endoscopies during the pollen season versus outside the pollen season, looking at the difference in the results and seeing if pollen is playing a role. And for some people, potentially dual treatment, so combination treatment with both diet and steroids potentially might be needed during the pollen season. But it is a bit of detective work, I think, thinking about the timing of doing things, looking at the different results and what's been tried. So it's piecing the pieces of the puzzle together. But yeah, working a bit carefully with your team to work it out, and also keeping a diary of the symptoms is really important. And when we think about the pollen season, actually it does span quite a long time, and it's, different for different pollens as well. So if you firstly look at tree pollen, so some of the trees do start to wake up in January. The peak of the seasons is shown in the green here. So most people with tree pollen allergy start to experience symptoms in kind of late February through March, but it might depend on the type of tree. The more common ones that we see in the UK are things like silver birch trees and alder and hazel tree pollen, but you'll see that these do kind of, the peak pollen for these different tree pollen does kind of start from mid-February all the way through to July for some of the different pollen. So that's quite a long pollen season. Grass pollen tends to start in May, but kind of peak in June, July, and then go through to August as well. A lot of people are sensitized to both tree and grass pollens, so again can be quite a long period of pollen season. And then we've got our weed pollens, again prolonging the period down at the bottom there as well. So Lucy, so my symptoms are really awful, but my gastroenterologist said that my EOE is in remission. Why do you think this is?
I mean, I think this is something we hear all the time, and it's really frustrating for patients in particular, that unfortunately the sort of the disease activity, so the number of cells in the food pipe, doesn't correlate very well to the symptoms, which means that you can have completely zero eosinophils in your esophagus, or definitely less than the 15 per high power field, but still have quite bad symptoms. Or the other way around, you can have hundreds of eosinophils in your food pipe and not suffer any symptoms at all. But we do often ask about symptoms in clinic, and particularly ones around eating, because it can help kind of track things over time. Although kind of day to day, you might not feel that the symptoms are much different. If we're tracking these and with a standardized questionnaire, it helps us kind of unpick the symptoms and relate that to the histology as well. So some key things we're thinking about is sort of the length of time with eating. So often we hear that, it takes me much longer to finish my dinner. It might be half an hour, 45 minutes to finish a meal. For children in particular, school lunchtime is a big problem, because some schools only get about 20 minutes to eat, and then they're out in the playground, for a quick run around before lessons in the afternoon. And for a lot of children with EOE, that's not enough time for them to finish their meal. So most of them, have a few bites of a sandwich and then, carry on with the rest of their day. There's also symptoms or feelings that food's getting stuck, or it's slow going down. So it can be physical, sort of what we call food bolus obstruction, and the EOS Network have some great resources about that. If you want to think about sort of managing these food bolus obstructions as they occur. I'd say working in pediatrics, they happen much less commonly than what we see in adult practice. But there is definitely reports where people feel that it's very slow in swallowing, or you can really be aware that you're swallowing a food down, which most of us aren't really aware of. Not being able to eat without fluid. So we think of that as if you sat down to eat a meal, could you not finish that without having, a chug of water every couple of mouthfuls or every mouthful? Because that helps lubricate the food and push it down the esophagus a little bit more easily. And we also see symptoms of things that we call rumination. So that's kind of bringing the food back up from the stomach into the back of the mouth, and either it being swallowed back down or, spat out. And that's something that's quite common in patients with EOE. Reduced appetite is a big problem. If you're feeling sick, you're feeling like you've got a stomach ache, you've got like heartburn or refluxy type symptoms, it can be very off-putting eating. So often we'll see that appetite is reduced, and as I said, nausea, and in some cases vomiting, or induced vomiting if you're needing to get an obstruction up. Okay, so we've gone through the process of excluding the foods and doing the repeat endoscopies. How do we go about reintroducing these foods into the diet?
Yeah, so it's definitely a key part of the process. So we're eliminating foods firstly to see if, we can get a remission, but then we need to reintroduce them to find out what the specific food triggers are. And ideally, foods should be introduced for at least 8 weeks before repeating the camera test with the biopsies. So I think our older practice, and I certainly used to do this based on some of the older studies, would be to reintroduce foods for 2 weeks, particularly some of the American studies. But from our, more research that's emerged, and also from my experience, I know that can be enough for some people, but it's certainly not enough for most people. And also having endoscopies after 2 weeks is quite invasive as well, having them that regularly. So reintroducing foods helps us to identify our food triggers. So the majority of people do have 1 or 2 food triggers, although it can be more. And our aim with reintroduction is to have like normal amounts of the food before the elimination. So that's why I always try and say to people is have it at least as often as you are having it in your baseline diet. So for things like milk and wheat, that's usually multiple times a day. For something like fish or nuts, it might be just a few times a week, so 2 or 3 times a week potentially. But so having it in normal amounts. And sometimes when you've avoided a food for a period, it's no longer part of your normal diet. It isn't something that you instinctively go back to having in the same amount. So we do try and advise people to have it frequently. And then our aim in the long term is to minimize the number of food exclusions. So we only want to avoid foods that we need to. And so most people do not need to avoid all 6 of these foods if they've responded to a 6-food elimination diet. I don't think I've actually ever seen anyone who's needed to avoid all 6 foods. It's would be quite unusual.
Mm.
So this is just an example of someone who's followed a 4-food elimination diet. So Sally has EOE. She's responded really well to her 4-food elimination of milk, wheat, egg, and soya. And we want to now know which foods are a trigger for her. Is it a combination, or is it one thing? So firstly, she introduced soya, and we do often start with introducing the lower risk foods first. When we're reintroducing, and that helps us to have a better chance of expanding the diet. If we were to introduce milk first for her, that's quite a high risk trigger. So the likelihood is she'll have to take that back out of her diet. So we like to start where we're likely to succeed. So she introduced soya. Her next camera test showed that she was still in remission, so she can continue to consume soya whilst introducing another food. She introduced egg, but her EOE, unfortunately, was no longer in remission on the repeat scope. So egg is a trigger for her. She removed egg, introduced wheat. Following this, her EOE is still in remission, so she can continue to have wheat and soya, but avoid egg. She then introduced milk, but was no longer in remission. So for Sally, the confirmed EOE triggers are cow's milk and egg. So this would be her long-term avoidance diet. So we do expect multiple endoscopies following a diagnosis of EOE. And this might mean for many people endoscopies every 8 to 12 weeks, although I think in practice with getting these booked in and life events getting in the way as well, and it can be a little bit longer, so it isn't really a structured every 8 to 12 weeks approach. It can be quite variable and take a bit of time to go through the whole process, and also depending on whether you respond to the diet or not. Once we are in remission and we've got our trigger foods, the endoscopies will reduce, often to just once a year, depending on your centre. This is quite a variable. There's no real standard guidance around this. So some of our patients don't have regular endoscopies once they've identified their triggers and have a treatment plan. So thinking about reintroduction, do we need to use ladders to reintroduce foods when we've excluded them?
Yeah, so I mean, mostly for me in pediatrics, we don't tend to use ladders to reintroduce. And when we're talking about a ladder, we're using something where we gradually increase the allergenicity of that protein. So we might use something that is highly processed, so like a baked form of milk to start with, and then gradually build it up with the very last step being fresh milk. And this similar sort of approach with egg. But actually for EOE, we generally don't use this type of approach in pediatrics, but it might depend on history. So if there is a history of sort of delayed food allergy alongside the EOE, we might use a ladder approach in that sense. But it's always important that your team who know you or know your child the best advise about that reintroduction sort of process. But in the most part, we wouldn't use a ladder to reintroduce in our practice.
Yeah, same in adults. We don't really use them very often.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this happens, we accidentally eat something that we're supposed to be eliminating. We're out at a restaurant and, we've had something slathered in butter. What should we do with that?
Yeah, so I think firstly, don't panic. It's not the end of the world. Like these things happen. It's actually very, very common. And we get contacted a lot about these things. So I think the first thing to do is like get in touch with your team, so your dietitian or your healthcare team, for advice about what to do. If you're in the middle of an 8 to 12 week elimination, there's a risk it could jeopardize the results. You need to let people know to get the appropriate advice. I think generally as a one-off exposure, it's probably unlikely to have a big impact, but it really does depend like what it was, you know, having a little bit of butter in the first few weeks of the elimination diet is very different from having, you know, the wrong type of milk 3 days in a row right at the end. So what was it? When was it? How much did you have? You know, and how often has it happened? Is really going to give us, you know, the right information to be able to tell you whether we need to potentially extend your elimination period, or, you know, not really worry about it too much, or just think about, we'll take that into account when we, you know, look at your results.
Yeah.
But do let us know. So once we've identified that we've got our food trigger, so I know that milk is my trigger, like how strict do I need to be? You know, can I have a little bit of chocolate, you know, now and again, or can I have some cake on my birthday?
So yes, I think this is a difficult question, because at the moment the advice is no, we should avoid these foods strictly. Having said that, we do know in practice, and me and Hannah were talking about this earlier, that some patients appear to be able to manage a little bit of some of these proteins occasionally and it not trigger their EOE. The difficulty here is that we have no standardized amounts that is safe, you know, for someone to eat without triggering their EOE. So that's why it's important at the time of endoscopy to really, you know, highlight to your team, you know, if occasionally you are having, you know, a chocolate bar once a month and then we do your test and it seems fine, you know, that's helpful information for us. But on the most part, we would say really strict avoidance wherever you can. And obviously, if these accidents happen, then just to let us know. But there are studies being done particularly looking at baked milk in eosinophilic esophagitis. So that might be things like cakes or, you know, biscuits, things like that have got some milk in them, but has been treated to a very high temperature. But for the moment, wherever possible, just try and avoid it as strictly as you can, unless advised otherwise. So, you know, what happens if the 6-food exclusion diet doesn't work? Are there other options for people? Or actually, if, you know, someone is just struggling and they decide they don't want to do dietary treatment anymore, is there something else that can be done to treat the EOE?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, you know, the second part of what you said as well is really important. I think I often, as part of my assessment, will talk to people about whether diet is even the right approach to begin with. So they might be referred in, but we go through their diet and there can be some, you know, red flags or you know, things that suggest that maybe diet isn't right for people, like if they're already very restrictive, if they've got any kind of, you know, food aversions or low weight or BMI, history of eating disorders, you know, various different things might lead us to think maybe diet isn't right for this person. So for some people, we might, you know, look at delaying a diet and thinking about addressing some other dietary concerns and improving the diet before even eliminating foods. But for some people, we might say, you know, actually, this isn't the right approach for you. And I always ask people, you know, how would you feel if you could never have milk or wheat, you know, ever again? You know, is that acceptable to you? And for some people, it just isn't. And so there's not a lot of point in going through an 8 to 12 week elimination if this isn't the right approach for that person. But there are alternatives. So medication is an alternative approach for lots of people. So we've got things like so PPIs, so proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole or lansoprazole or others, can be an effective treatment for some people with EOE specifically. Also our swallowed steroids. So we've got different off-license asthma treatments, things like Flixotide and budesonide that we can use as a swallowed steroid. But there is now a product called Jorveza, which is an orodispersible steroid, which is highly effective in treating lots of people. So it is a really good option that's being used for lots of our adult patients nowadays. It is a steroid, and lots of people are a bit afraid of taking steroids, but it is a very low dose steroid in comparison to steroid tablets that people do take. So it's a much smaller dose, and also it acts very locally and it's not absorbed into the bloodstream like other steroids are. So the risk of the long-term risks are much lower, and it's considered to be very safe. So it is an option for lots of people, but other options are, we talked a bit about the elemental diet. in the beginning, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But that is an alternative treatment if the 6-food elimination diet hasn't worked as a last resort, potentially in someone who also hasn't responded to the medication or who hasn't tolerated any of these medications, so they can have some side effects as well. And for some people, it's a combination treatment. So we've touched about combining elimination diets with medication, which is an approach that works well for some people as well. So the elemental diet, which, as Lucy mentioned, is drinking amino acid based feed for as a kind of sole source of nutrition, and this is extremely challenging. So if any of you have ever tasted it, it does have quite a bitter taste. It's quite it's not the most enjoyable thing to drink. Often the volumes required are quite large, and I haven't put this on here as a challenging, but my adults who've been on an elemental diet often, like the actual having no actual food is quite challenging, not having anything to chew, having people describe getting like crunch envy. So actually not eating food, food is an important part of our life. It's a big, and lots of people enjoy eating food, and it's a big part of lots of different interactions we have as well. So not eating is really difficult. These products are also very expensive to prescribe, and sometimes it's not possible to get them prescribed, so they're not licensed. Particularly in adults, it can be quite tricky. So the GP might not agree to prescribe these products as a kind of elemental diet treatment. The reintroduction process, having eliminated all foods and then needing to add foods back in over 8 to 12 weeks, is extremely lengthy and quite tricky. So that's another really, really big challenge with an elemental diet, and also the kind of the acceptability of this treatment. So I think there is some evidence as well that if you are going to undertake an elemental diet, like having a kind of a test day over 24 hours is really helpful to know if it's even going to be possible, because some people really can't do it for all these reasons, or they get kind of side effects from it as well, like kind of symptoms, and just can't tolerate it. So like we mentioned, it's really a last resort, a treatment.
Thank you so much. I think you've covered many, many topics and answered lots of the questions that we've received through our community. And it'll be interesting to see if someone can find a question that you didn't already cover.